My name's Alexander Lindley, and I'd like to record a vlog on starting a spiritual community. I've been involved in various spiritual communities since my spiritual awakening in 2004. And before that, I was part of various religions, the Catholic Church, parts of the Christian Church, and during that time I was quite drawn to community and the idea of community, and I sought out communities. When I finished university and first moved to London for my first proper job, I lived in a community building. It was actually part of a Christian youth work centre, and the idea was that you got reduced rent in return for helping out on a weekly basis with the children's clubs. And I think there were about 10 or 12 rooms in that community building, that accommodation block. I think when I was living there was only either 6 or 8 people, so some of the rooms were unoccupied, but we did live as a community, and everybody had to cook a meal in the evenings for the rest of the building once a week, things like that. And I quite like aspects of that, but I only stayed there for a year, so maybe I didn't like it that much. And also throughout my life, I've liked visiting monasteries or other sort of spiritual centres for either individual retreats or led workshops or retreats. Always been quite interested in that. Maybe it's something about structure, something about a sense of family and belonging, a sense of, common purpose, of a sort of spiritual nature. And since my awakening, I was living in London in 2004, and my spiritual awakening was partly off the back of finding out about complementary health therapies, especially initially it was homeopathy. I think I had a vague interest in acupuncture, but that didn't really sort of take off. Didn't like that idea, but homeopathy worked for me, resonated with me, and I think that started to open me up spiritually. And that led to other sort of explorations with things like meditation and herbalism and flower essences, flower remedies. And then I was drawn to the College of Psychic Studies in London, and I attended various courses and workshops and events there, and had sessions with some of the mediums and psychics there. And then I started to get a sort of interest in Glastonbury, and I started visiting Glastonbury. I found a particular spiritual centre, spiritual community called Shambhala, which no longer exists. The Shambhala Centre in Glastonbury at the foot of the Tor, so a very place of very sort of powerful spiritual energies, and I really felt a calling to visit Glastonbury and visit that centre in particular. And there was a practitioner who ran it, and she taught many things, but one of the things she taught, or workshops she gave, was magnified healing, which is a bit like Reiki but a bit more niche. So I did the training, the initiation, the kind of courses in magnified healing, and I attended some other events there, and I liked the feel of it, actually. I mean, it was quite niche, and but she ran it as a sort of bed and breakfast for tourists, for visitors, and the sort of spiritual stuff was kind of optional. And I kind of quite liked that. Yeah, I mean, there's something about the house which felt welcoming and sort of there was like a nice spiritual energy there. I mean, she had tons of these huge crystals, huge amethyst crystals everywhere. And obviously she'd put a lot of work into getting the energy of the house and the garden and, you know, kind of right for her purposes. So, you know, I felt a really strong spiritual energy there, which worked for me, resonated with me. It might have, yeah, it might not have worked for other people, but yeah, because I think, yeah, and so I attended that centre and got to know a few people through that, and I mean, it did have a sense of pilgrimage. I mean, Glastonbury has been a centre of pilgrimage for centuries, maybe millennia in the UK. So, you know, I wasn't the sort of first to kind of feel that calling, that pull, but and I liked being Glastonbury, and Glastonbury had a huge abbey which was demolished during the Reformation. Henry VIII ordered all the monasteries to be knocked down so he could assert his power more. But prior to that, Glastonbury had been the biggest abbey in England. Again, partly because its location and the fact that people were drawn to Glastonbury to come on pilgrimage, go on pilgrimage. So I liked sort of walking around the abbey as well. And then in 2011, well, I moved out of London in 2008 to live in Brighton, and then in 2011 I was renting. My landlord decided he wanted to sell the flat, so he gave me notice to move out. And initially I tried to find somewhere else in Brighton, and I actually found somewhere and put a holding deposit down. But I'd been visiting Glastonbury a lot in the preceding sort of 2 or 3 years, and I felt that maybe this was like a push from the universe, a push from spirit, that now might be a time to relocate to Glastonbury. And it was actually physically and practically and financially possible. And I just started a relationship, and the fact that I was in a relationship kind of gave me a little more kind of confidence, of feeling a bit more of support, of somebody alongside me. So that helped make the decision to actually move to Glastonbury, which I did in 2011. And yeah, and I did feel sort of spirit was sort of guiding me, because you know, it was easy for me to find somewhere to live. You know, I visited Glastonbury, went around a couple of estate agents, had 1 or 2 viewings, and you know, the first place I saw I really liked, and I ended up getting that place. You know, it was just easy. It's like the spirit world had sort of smoothed the way for me, and that was on top of Windmill Hill in Glastonbury. I kind of quite liked the location, and I loved the flat, and Glastonbury is full of different spiritual communities and sort of religions and traditions, and you know, druids and witches and wizards, all that New Age stuff. There was lots and lots of stuff. So I kind of really loved it. And you know, different people gravitate towards different things, but I tried out sort of the druids. I was quite interested in the druids, and also found a spiritual community called Open Hand, the Open Hand community, run by what was Chris Bourne then. He later changed his name to Open. And yeah, so I became part of that spiritual community, which was quite a lot of it was online really, and some of it was like in-person workshops or events or groups or retreats, and I kind of quite liked that as well. Yeah, it just, I liked the idea of common purpose, exploration, thinking about esoteric, spiritual, otherworldly things, and that was great. And maybe around that time I did start getting the feeling that, you know, one day I'd like to set up something like that of my own, or perhaps in conjunction with some others, some kind of spiritual community, but I didn't really have much idea of what that might be about. So yeah, so I kind of arrived in Glastonbury, and I thought I'd found my spiritual home and I'd be there for years and years and years, or decades, or for the rest of my life. But Glastonbury sort of drew me towards itself or towards herself, and then all of a sudden pushed me out somewhat unexpectedly. And I went off traveling around the world, well, around Asia. I had the time, the opportunity, the money, the possibility to do that. And that was almost like it felt like a kind of, I felt like a calling as well. It felt like, almost like it felt like a now or never moment that, because at the time I think I was 47 or 48, and I'd never really done the travel around Asia or the India thing, and some of my friends and cousins had done that, and I've always been a bit envious of them, and I thought to myself, well, that's what I really want to do. I don't in fact want to sort of stay in Glastonbury and try and start up some sort of spiritual community now. I'm not ready for that. So I kind of followed that pull, that calling, and I got the message, if you like, or the thought, or the calling to travel around Asia. I think I got that in about November of 2012, I think it was, or December 2012 even. And it took me sort of 3 or 4 months really to make that a reality, because I decided that I'd go off traveling around Asia and I might actually never return to live in the UK. So I might settle somewhere else, because the person I was in a relationship with actually lived in the Far East. So I thought I might be able to settle with her somewhere in that part of the world. That didn't turn out in the end, but that was in the back of my mind. So I felt that I wanted and needed to really, pack up my life in the UK properly, so that I wouldn't have any practical or financial or other sort of ties that I had to go back to. So that took about 3 or 4 months really, from feeling that pull, that calling, to actually getting on the plane with just a rucksack of stuff on my back, and 2 or 3 boxes that I left at my mum's, essential sort of documents or bit of memorabilia. I mean, I tried to get rid of everything. I didn't own any properties, so I just ended the tenancy on my flat. Sold my car and got rid of all my furniture and most of my belongings. Even most of my crystals, I kind of sold or gave away. I sort of pared down what I wanted to keep as material possessions to the very minimum. Easily fitted in the back of a small car. I think it was 3 or 4 medium-sized boxes in a suitcase that I left at my mum's. And then I set off on this wonderful spiritual adventure with just a sort of medium-sized rucksack. It wasn't, well, I had a sort of medium-sized rucksack. It wasn't huge, and I also had a sort of smaller sort of day bag. But really, that's all I took onto the plane. And that felt pretty liberating. And I knew I was going off on a spiritual adventure, and I knew that what I really wanted to do was to trek in the Himalayas. So my initial destination was Nepal. So I flew to Nepal via Qatar or somewhere in and I kind of landed in Kathmandu, and I booked the Kathmandu guest house to stay for a few nights to sort of land, find my feet, because I'd heard that was as a good place to arrive, and it was quite comfortable and been around for a long time. And then the adventure started really, and because I had a vague idea of where I might want to go, but I hadn't made any detailed itineraries. So I arrived in Kathmandu, and I knew I wanted to go trekking, and I didn't like Kathmandu when I arrived particularly. It was big, noisy, bustling, dirty, smelly, hot city, crowded, and I didn't like it. So I within 2 or 3 days, I'd flown to Pokhara, a much smaller place, smaller city to the west, and that had access to other parts of the Himalayas, and I went sort of trekking in the Annapurna region, and it was just amazing time, because I'd never travelled outside Europe before, well, apart from the United States, I think, so it was like eye-opening, and it was like a really exciting adventure, and I felt pretty kind of brave and relatively little sort of fear, because, I was 48 and traveling on my own in Nepal. And, there are lots of other sort of backpackers there, but mostly quite a lot younger than me. Still some sort of my kind of age, but I was on a spiritual quest really, and I was just open to where it might take me. So I started off trekking the Himalayas, and I found my way to a monastery, the Kopan monastery, just outside Kathmandu, after my first trek, and did a course there on discovering Buddhism, and got to know a group of people, met a friend there, somebody became a friend and travelled with me, and then, I sort of I did go to India, I knew that I did want to go to India, so from Nepal, after about 2 or 3 months in Nepal, and quite a bit of trekking in the Himalayas, I then flew to Delhi and I spent time in several regions in India. And again, I kind of went to kind of monasteries or Buddhist centers or yoga ashrams. I sort of tried that kind of thing, and went to spend quite a bit of time in Rishikesh, which is like the meditation capital of India. And it was a fantastic experience. And and then I also later on in my travels, I went to Thailand and Bali, and I was going to go on to Australia, but by the time I got to Bali, it was nearly a year, and I had thought to myself that maybe it'll just be for a year. And I'd only bought insurance for a year. Not that I really believe in insurance that much, but I had it in the back of my mind that, well, either I'm going to settle in a different country and never return to the UK, or, I'll travel for a year and then go back to the UK. And the latter is what happened. And then when I arrived back in the UK, it was either going to be Brighton or Glastonbury, and I chose Brighton for various reasons. And again, it was quite miraculous the way I found accommodation. I turned up in Brighton with no job, and I went round a couple of estate agents. And the first place I viewed, I loved it. I took it. I told them that I was an accountant and had been travelling, and I was going to get back to work, and they kind of believed me, even though that's not what turned out at all. But from a financial point of view, I was able to get good accommodation very easily. So I felt that the universe, spirit was paving the way, for that. So I spent 12 years living in Brighton, and I've just moved to Great Malvern in Worcestershire 12 days ago. And again, that felt like the universe gave me a push to move out of Brighton. And I've landed up here, Great Malvern, and this feels like quite a sort of spiritual centre, spiritual location, with the Malvern Hills and the history of it being a spa town, and all the springs, all the freshwater springs that are around on the hills, and how the locals and visitors, fill up their water canisters and drink the water, a bit like in Glastonbury, the Chalice Well, the White Spring, Red Spring. So again, I feel I've arrived at a sort of spiritual location with strong spiritual energies, and so that's all kind of like background really, because I'm 62 now, and I've been on the spiritual path for 20 odd years, 22 years since what I would identify as my awakening. But I think I've probably always been a very spiritual person, just I had this sort of different access to my spirituality from 2004 onwards. Some of the kind of conditioning and kind of restrictions or limitations sort of fell away, in terms of religion, I suppose. So I moved from religion to spirituality, really. So regarding starting a spiritual community, I've had this idea for a long time, but it's never got to the point of being able to start anything up. I've tried to sort of run a few meditation groups, and I was quite interested in manifestation techniques for manifesting, using spiritual and magical techniques to bring what you want or more of what you want into your life. So I was quite interested in relationship manifestation and experimented with other forms of manifestation around money or accommodation or travel adventures, this kind of thing. So I do know quite a lot about manifestation techniques, and they have their upsides and their downsides. I've learned that, you know, you don't get anything for free, really. You know, if you use manifestation to bring something into your life, then there is a cost, there is a price to pay, you know, perhaps in some other area of your life. You know, it's not just a question of asking the universe for X, Y, and Z and it falling into your lap without anything else changing or any cost or effort or difficulty. You know, it doesn't work like that, I've realized. So yeah, I'm not sure whether manifestation is really my thing. But I'm still interested in aspects of that. So if I was to start a spiritual community or be involved in one, you know, the big question would be, you know, what would be the focus of this community? What would be the purpose? What would be the teachings, if you like, or the philosophy or the modality? You know, why is it there? You know, how is it meant to help others? You know, and the thought that's coming to my mind is to form a spiritual community around the idea of finding your spiritual path, you know, helping people find their spiritual path through the various things that I've experienced over the last 20 odd years, you know, ways of exploring your spirituality or your psyche, or, you know, what's important to you, and, you know, what does spirituality mean to you, and what does the spiritual path mean, you know. I mean, I would say that, you know, spiritual is kind of like almost like the opposite of material. You know, you've got the material world, the practical, physical world that we live in, the 3D world, you know, the things we have around us, money, jobs, you know, and, you know, a lot of people in the world that's all they'll live by, you know, they want to earn money, have good jobs and careers, accumulate possessions, go on holidays, have properties, you know, feel that status that comes with money, possessions, job titles, and, you know, that's what's important to them. So that's what I mean by the material. And the spiritual is, you know, is like everything that's not material, everything that science can't measure, you know, beliefs, intuition, emotion, philosophies, you know, how you feel inside about your purpose or the meaning of life, connecting to higher dimensions or connecting to God or spirit, you know, through prayer, meditation, spiritual practices, time in nature, this kind of thing, and also maybe the wider esoteric world of psychics and mediums and you know, so this kind of thing. People who might be derogatorily described as sort of woo-woo, you know, but I'm very interested in the woo-woo, you know, in the etheric, the esoteric, the you know, what's beyond the realms of what our five physical senses can detect, you know. So that's kind of what I mean by spiritual, really. And then I think the focus or the philosophy, the purpose of the spiritual community is like the first thing that needs to be identified. And then, you know, where would it happen? You know, these days a lot of things are online, and I think that would be a good starting point, you know, to start a spiritual community online. And then in-person workshops or groups, or, you know, could happen as well. I've run a few of those in the past, so I know what that involves, what that's about. And of course, it will probably end up being hybrid, you know. I mean, the Open Hand community that I mentioned is very much hybrid, you know. A lot of it's online and some of it's in person, and that seems to work well together. The Shambhala Center that I attended, that was all in person, really. There wasn't any online element to it. So, once I've got established and aware would this community, spiritual community happen, the next question was, what would be the format? I think a website would be extremely important to, where, so there'd be a point people could go to sort of find out, what is this community about? What are its teachings, or what's its purpose? How does it work? So that would be a key thing to set up initially. And then there'd be the events themselves, the community events or the groups. And that would be, there'll be a mixture of things. There'd be sort of online seminars or webinars, online workshops over Zoom, for example, groups, perhaps meeting weekly, or, series of groups on a particular theme. And Facebook, I'm quite familiar with Facebook, so there'd be a Facebook page or a Facebook community. And there's other social media sort of platforms which I'm not so familiar with. So I'd probably want to stick to a website and some kind of Facebook group or page. And the final thing I've written down on this sheet is, a name for the community. I think that would sort of develop over time. I've got some initial ideas which probably are a good starting point, but wouldn't come to sort of fruition. But to find a name that gives people some kind of sense of what this spiritual community is about, I think that's like a good sort of summary of where I'm at the moment in terms of my ideas about starting a spiritual community. And I think also I probably need to be, in a way this is quite difficult for me to say and to be a bit humble about it, and just allow Spirit or the universe, God, to sort of guide me and show me, and that might involve a bit of waiting. Well, it certainly has involved a bit of waiting. I've been waiting at least 15 years since I first started to get the idea that I could do something like this. So, this has to be done in God's time, really, or I would want it to be more of God than of me, and I do have an ego and some issues around ego and wanting attention and wanting to be noticed, and so that that's kind of might be kind of an issue. But also I want to sort of serve. I feel I've been put on this earth for a purpose, and I've had difficulty finding my place in the world of paid work. I've been fortunate that money has come to me from other sources, so I haven't had to do a lot of paid work for a very long time. But I would like to find a way to make a more, I was going to say visible contribution to the world through everything I've sort of learned and experienced, by helping to start or to run or to be involved in some kind of spiritual community in the future, which helps others, which sort of gives others some teaching or direction or support or focus that is helpful for them. So I want to be a sort of channel, really, for God, for Spirit to work through me and to sort of serve others. I want to be coming from a place of service and humility rather than sort of ego and ambition. So I think that's probably a good place to stop. It's been quite exciting recording this, actually. The idea just sort of came from inside it. Actually, I had a very, very difficult day yesterday, very emotionally painful day with certain things affecting me. And I often find that after a deep dive into some great emotional pain or distress or confusion, then clarity follows, and that's what I'm experiencing today. So I have a bit more clarity about what I might like to do in the future in terms of starting a spiritual community. So I'll stop there, and any thoughts, comments, reflections or questions are very welcome. Bye now.